Met everybody. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'll give me just a moment, I'm kind of letting everybody get settled and get connected to audio. So if you'll give it just a second, we'll start with some announcements and then we will get started with the seminar for today. All right, it looks like everybody is officially connected to audio and ready to go at this point. So once again, thank you so much for joining us for week 7 of our spring seminar. It's kind of hard to believe that we're definitely at that halfway point of the spring, especially with COVID. I feel like this whole year has just blurred by. But I'm so excited to introduce our speakers for this week to you. We're going to be continuing our unit about communicating in the real world, but now instead of just talking about general effective strategies for communication, we're going to pivot a bit and talk about intercultural communication and what it looks like to communicate with people from different cultures, different linguistic backgrounds, and different countries. With that being said, I'm going to start with just a few announcements so that I can then turn it over to Claire and Tyler for the rest of the seminar. So just a couple of things to be aware of, friends. First of all, it's Women's History Month, and there are tons of cool events going on with the Office of Campus Life in honor of Women's History Month. So if you haven't checked this out yet, definitely check out the Office of Campus Life calendar. And what I will do is I will also copy and paste this into the chat. But what I want to do is share this with you because if you haven't already laid this calendar over your own, definitely do that because basically you can always see what events are happening on campus and it's just right there on your own Google Calendar. So definitely take a look at this. If there's anything that you find interesting, get involved, attend, and I don't think that you'll regret it. There are a lot of really cool things happening. In addition, if you are not a regular checker of your Hawk email, definitely get on that. The Office of Campus Life, and the email address is welcomedesk@iit.edu, has started sending out weekly update emails outlining all of the events that are going on campus each week. And you can always register for ones that require registration. So make sure that welcomedesk@iit.edu is added to your safe list so that it doesn't go to your spam, and definitely check for those updates in your email. The most recent one that was talking about Women's History Month week 2 even had a list of women-owned restaurants, businesses in the city to go check out. And now that things are starting to open up with COVID because the rates are down, you can actually get out and socialize in the city and have a little bit of fun. So check out those women-owned businesses and restaurants. If there's something you love that you think is really cool that you want to share, you're always welcome to drop it into the chat during the seminar and kind of encourage other people to check those things out as well. In addition, friends, as I said before, thank you so much for your feedback on the FYE Spring Survey. I've announced this a few times already, but these are the topics that were voted as being the most interesting and the things that you wanted to see from the First Year Experience seminar. So after we finish up our unit on communication, we will be having a seminar that's all about building a robust college experience, getting involved on campus and things like that. We'll have 3 seminars that are all about career readiness using the topics that you see in the bullet points. And then we'll be finishing up the year with a seminar on financial literacy from one of our own human resources representatives who's kind of our expert in investing and budgeting and salary negotiation. So very excited about those things to come. And then next week, the 2 speakers that I'm getting ready to introduce, Claire Johnson and Tyler Hardy, are going to join us again to continue this communication in the real world unit. And once again, they will continue focusing on intercultural communication and what that actually looks like. So who are these 2 people that I'm getting ready to introduce to you? Claire and Tyler are both admission counselors within our Office of Undergraduate Admission who specifically work with our international recruitment team. So both of them are incredibly well-traveled. Both have lived abroad for periods of time. Both have traveled to various different international locations, have a lot of experience interacting with diverse cultures around the world. And so they are definitely going to be speaking to you from experience whenever they talk about intercultural communication. So I am so excited to turn this over to them and to let them share some of those experiences and how it might apply to you as a student. And then later on, when you get into the real world and into your career. So Claire and Tyler, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marky. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everyone, and then we'll get going. So, can everyone see this okay? My computer's moving slow today, but we'll get it up and running. Awesome. So as Marky said, Tyler and I are going to be joining all of you for the next 3 weeks to go into a really hopefully engaging discussion about communicating in the real world and intercultural communication specifically. So as Marky already introduced us, my name is Claire Johnson. I'm a senior international admission counselor in the Office of Admissions, and I'm joined by Tyler, who I will let him introduce himself as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tyler, and I work along with Claire in the Office of Undergraduate Admissions as an international admission counselor as well.
Awesome. And we're both really excited to be a part of the FYE experience and to share our knowledge with all of you. So in terms of our agenda, week 1 today will be introductions, and then we're going to give kind of a brief overview about the book, The Culture Map, which is what formed the backdrop for the next 3 weeks and the content that we'll be sharing. And what is discussed in the culture map are 8 scales. And so in the first week, we'll go through scales 1 through 2. And then in the second week, we'll continue on with the discussion of the culture map and those scales and go more in depth about scales 3 through 6. And then in our final week, we'll wrap up with scales 7 and 8, and then have some time for final thoughts and really understanding, what does this all mean that we've been discussing over the past 3 weeks, and how can you carry that forward into your academic as well as professional careers. So we'll just move right along with some housekeeping items as well. We do encourage you to have your phone ready because we will have some polls and other quizzes throughout this week as well as the next 2 weeks. And it's easiest to participate if you can just pull out your phone and access those links and the QR codes to get to those polls and quizzes. Be ready to participate and share your thoughts. So this first week will be pretty lecture heavy, with most of the talking being done by myself and Tyler. But after that, we really want to make sure that all of you are getting engaged and really discussing amongst each other. So just be ready to come into the next couple weeks, willing to share your thoughts. And throughout that time, do feel free to unmute your mic, post thoughts in the chat box, and just really participate and engage, because we want to really make this fun and exciting. And the best way to do that is to discuss. So without further ado, we'll get into the week 1 introduction in scales 1 through 2 of the culture map. But first, take out that phone because we are going to take a poll really quick. So if you can scan that QR code, that will actually, or should take you to our polling page. And
there'll be 2 questions.
Yeah, Tyler actually created this poll, so I'll kind of let him introduce it. I think we were going to let everyone access it first before we show the results, just so that you're not swayed in any particular direction. But put in the chat box if you're having trouble accessing that poll. I know sometimes it can be a little goofy, but if everyone is able to get there and answer the questions, then we'll give a couple minutes for everyone to do that.
When you're done answering the poll, if you don't mind just posting in the chat box, finished, that'd be great. Let's give it like 30 seconds to a minute.
Yeah, you don't want to spend too much time overthinking the questions, because it really should just be your initial thoughts about what your first reaction is to these questions. I see a couple people are done. Awesome. Maybe a couple more minutes and we can Did you want us to go to the results now, Tyler, or wait until?
Let's give it a few more seconds, and then we can go to the results.
Cool.
So see, it only allows you to answer one question. That's okay. We'll just show the results for that first question then. So let's show the results for that first question.
Okay, we'll exit out of here and I'll jump over to our poll. So these are, can everyone see this okay?
So the question was, which generally describes what good communication means to you when working in a group? So interestingly enough, it's 6-4, so about evenly matched. In the next slides, we're going to talk about how this mindset may be cultural in some ways, and how it compares to other countries and other people. So just hold on to the results for this in your head, and we'll go from there. Do you want to go to the next question then? All right. And then do they need the QR code again, or?
It should work using the code at the top.
Okay. Yeah.
I think maybe we should probably continue on though, just because I know we don't have a ton of time.
Yeah, let's move on.
We see one person coming in.
All right. So yeah, I think we can move on then, but it looks like the first person, a lot of people like negative feedback provided softly, subtly, diplomatically. And we have someone liking it, frankly, bluntly. So we'll be able to look at that as well, cultural wise, in the next slides too.
Yeah, and we can come back to this as well, because it is interesting to see these results. Oh, someone chose option 3. That's not an option. Just kidding. Okay, so we'll get back into our presentation and provide more context on the poll that you just took. But before we get into that, it is important for us to go over exactly what the culture map is. And this is a book written by Erin Meyer, who is a professor at the well-known university in INSEAD. And she works also with professionals who are making the transition to working in a different country and how to adjust to a different environment when you've grown up with certain cultural understandings about communication or timeliness, but then you have to realize other countries do it differently. So she provides training on those types of topics. And so she wrote this book so that all of us can better understand these cultural differences and really how it influences the way that people from diverse backgrounds work together and the challenges that can arise when misunderstandings may occur. And so then it goes into providing steps to effectively overcome these misunderstandings and cultural communication barriers so that you can successfully work with your colleagues, whether that's in a professional environment or in an educational setting, whatever it might be. And within the book itself, the topics that are discussed are put along this framework of the 8 scales, which we'll go into a discussion of all of these over the next few weeks, but just a broad overview. We first have communication, evaluating, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, scheduling, and persuading. And this chart here shows how across these different scales, generally speaking, depending on what country or culture you come from, you have a certain mindset about how one should operate within those scales. So you can see where the US falls, generally speaking, along the scales compared to a variety of other countries. And that's what makes this very fascinating, is the fact that it is relative. So you might feel like you're very low context on the communicating scale, but maybe compared to another country, you're actually quite high context. So it's all relative. And this probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense now, but again, we are going to jump into a more in-depth discussion about each of these scales. And so why is it important to understand these 8 scales? And really, it just all comes down to, small differences in how we communicate and what is considered the proper way to communicate can impact how we understand each other and complete our work, whether that's on a group project in school, in the business world, whatever it might be. And so being able to develop a better understanding and appreciation of how others think along the 8 scales, how we think differently, how we think similarly, can help to improve our communication, and then related to that, our relationships with each other. And ultimately, that leads to greater success and just working better together if we can step outside of ourselves and our own mindset and jump into the shoes of someone else and really fully understand where they're coming from in their viewpoints and their mindsets. And many of these differences may seem small and inconsequential, and you might think, why does it matter if I'm more on time than someone else? But it can really be crucial to helping you to achieve goals when working with diverse groups of individuals, and really just creating a much more enjoyable and accepting environment if everyone is able to take time to take a step back and understand each other. So for example, when is it the best time to speak up or stay quiet when you're working in a group? What's the role of the leader? And as our poll was showing us, how should feedback be given and what is the most constructive method of doing so? So before we dive in, though, it is important to keep in mind that we're not trying to stereotype everyone along these 8 scales. Every individual is different. And so even if a certain region or part of the world generally falls within one area of a scale, there's always going to be individual differences between people within that country. So it's important to continue to respect and appreciate both cultural differences as well as individual differences within that certain culture or region. So now we'll go into scales 1 and 2 and provide some background and context on the poll that you all just did. I'll pass it off to Tyler.
Awesome, thanks, Claire. So the first one that we're going to be going over is communication. So focusing on low context versus high context communication. So if you remember at the very beginning, that first poll, I asked what is good communication to you? Is it precise, simple, and clear, or is it sophisticated, nuanced, and layered? So it looks like there was about an equal amount right there. Most people said they like precise, simple, and clear, which if you look at this poll right here, you can see the US all the way on the low context side. So we're pretty low context. We like everything simple, clear, and to the point. And if you compare it to, say, France on that scale, and we compare ourselves to them, it would be a little bit different in terms of our communication. You may think that maybe you're a little more high context, but comparatively as a culture, it may be a little different compared to another country. So just, again, low context cultures are more rule oriented. Knowledge is public, accessible. Cultural behavior is spelled out explicitly. With high context cultures, it's less verbally explicit communication, an internalized understanding of what is communicated. So if you look at the high context, and Japan is right there. And we're going to give you an example in the next slide to go over this idea a little bit more. So Claire, if you want to move on.
Yeah, and I can talk about this example. This is actually from the Culture Map book. And since we couldn't require all of you to read the Culture Map, even it is a great book, so we do recommend reading it if you do have the chance. But because we know that not everyone is coming into this with the background of having read the book, we wanted to provide some excerpts just to further explain what these scales mean. So here's an example of high context communication. So high context, if you just remember from the previous slide, is much more, you have to have a deep cultural relationship with others in that culture to really understand what's going on. And it's speaking in the kind of more with in-depth understandings or ingrained cultural understandings rather than explicitly stating what's going on. So in Japan, we implicitly learn as we are growing up to communicate between the lines and to listen between the lines when others are speaking. Communicating messages without saying them directly is a deep part of our culture, so deep that we do it without even realizing it. To give an example, every year in Japan, there is a vote for the most popular new word. A few years ago, the word of the year was KY. It stands for Kuki yo Manai. Sorry if I completely butchered that. But this means one who cannot read the air. In other words, it's a person sorely lacking the ability to read between the lines. In Japan, if you can't read the air, you are not a good listener. So this just really shows that a lot of what is said in Japanese culture or in high context cultures is not actually said. It's something you have to sort of take in and understand through just being very culturally aware and having a strong familiarity with the culture itself. And so this can be really difficult in a lot of ways for outsiders of that culture to fully understand what is going on because they're used to having everything written out explicitly. So for example, here in the US, we're the opposite. We're very low context rather than high context. So anywhere you go, there's going to be signs telling you what to do. Everything's explained in great depth. You don't have to have a strong familiarity with the culture to understand what's being communicated. And so you can see already how if you're working in a group of people who some may be more low context and some may be more high context, there can be cultural misunderstandings because some are used to having everything explicitly written out and others are not. So it's fascinating, the differences between that. And I did see that someone just popped something into the chat box. I'm gonna pull that up.
Yeah, it's Illinois Tech Visit. I've seen the same philosophy applied to essay writing with Japanese students. They often rely on this reader understanding the context and don't explicitly provide certain details. Learning to write essays in the US can be quite a learning curve given our explicit style of explanation. Yeah, that's one way to look at it, definitely. I think there is that huge learning curve given that need for, I guess, clarity in what we do.
Yeah. Is there anyone that would maybe like to unmute themselves or put in the chat box their thoughts on this first scale and maybe explain why you chose the answer you chose when you were filling out the poll? We'd love to hear if anyone has anything to share.
Feel free to or post in the chat box.
If not, that's okay. We will have a little bit of time, but so at the end you can always share as well. But we'll move on to the next scale, which is evaluating, and I will pass that off to Tyler as well.
Okay, so this next scale that we're going to go over is evaluating. So how negative feedback is given. So if you remember the poll question at the very beginning, I asked you, how would you prefer negative feedback be given to you? So there's two scales on this end, direct negative feedback. So negative feedback is provided bluntly without being cushioned by positive feedback, and indirect feedback. So negative feedback is provided softly and diplomatically, the sandwich method. So sandwiched between two nice things with a not so great thing right in the middle. So interestingly enough, I believe most of you chose the indirect feedback route. On this scale itself, we are smack dab in the middle. But then you look at one end, Israel's all the way on one end. So direct negative feedback, they're very blunt with the kind of feedback that they give. And indirect negative feedback, again, you look at Japan, Thailand, Indonesia, they aren't as direct, and you may have to read between the lines a little bit more to understand what they may be criticizing you or giving you feedback on. So we're going to go over an example in this next slide that sort of talks a little bit about why this matters and how to address it. So to start, I'll read this. In Germany, we typically use strong words when complaining or criticizing in order to make sure the message registers clearly and honestly. Of course, we assume others will do the same. My British boss during a one-on-one suggested that I think about doing something differently. So I took his suggestion, I thought about it, and decided not to do it. Little did I know that his phrase was supposed to be interpreted as change your behavior right away or else. And I can tell you, I was pretty surprised when my boss called me into his office to chew me out for insubordination. I learned then and there that I needed to ignore all of the soft words surrounding the message when listening to my British teammates and just analyze the message as if it were given to me raw. Of course, the other lesson was to consider how my British staff might interpret my messages, which I had been delivering as purely as possible with no softeners whatsoever. I realize now that when I give feedback in my German way, I may actually use words that make the message sound as strong as possible without thinking much about it. I've been surrounded by this pure negative feedback since I was a child. So as you can see, a lot of the ways we deal with negative feedback or give out negative feedback is directly influenced by our culture, by the way that we were raised. So this German employee obviously had to adapt into not being so harsh or not using such strong of words when giving feedback to other people, but two, also interpreting his boss's words in a different way, and reading them, I guess, learning to read between the lines to know that it is a serious implication, even though the words aren't as strong as what the German would use. And this applies to, working in groups. Sometimes you have to interpret, what's the best way to work with someone who works in a different style than you do. So this is one way to look at that. Does anyone have any comments or questions on this slide in itself about negative feedback?
Or does anyone have an example or a time they experienced this where perhaps you were using the sandwich method, since that's your preferred method of giving feedback? So you told someone in a group you were working on a project with that you really liked the way they did this part of the project, but there was one area that could be improved. And then you followed up that area of improvement with another compliment on their work. And you assumed they would understand that, meaning there's an area of improvement that needs to be addressed. They should do something about it. But perhaps did they not understand that correctly and didn't actually improve the area that needed to be improved? Or any other type of communication misunderstanding in terms of feedback given. If anyone has an example they'd like to share, it would be interesting to hear, because I know that you've all experienced this in some way.
You can talk about providing or receiving feedback and how it relates to this. It would be interesting to hear.
Mentors, I know you've got some experience with this from this semester. Does anyone want to share either receiving or providing feedback? And, did it go well? Did it not go well? Why do you think that was?
Oh, interesting. So I usually provide direct feedback only to close friends, since they won't get mad. That's actually a good point. Maybe it does change depending on who you're speaking with and how well you know them. I would definitely agree with that. I feel more confident in being a little bit more direct with negative feedback if I know that someone's not going to get mad or get offended. So thank you for sharing that, Humberto. That's actually very interesting.
It definitely depends maybe on the situation that you're in as well as your culture. And I think it's also important to consider that our version of direct feedback may not be as intense as, say, the German version of direct feedback as well. So just remember, everything's sort of comparative as well.
Yeah, which I think is one of the parts of all of these scales that is the most fascinating, and as we'll see throughout the next couple of weeks, is just the comparison between us and others, and how we relate to each other. And it's just so amazing, these differences that we have. And of course it can lead to miscommunication, but the better that we understand it, the more we can appreciate it and then really strive to better communicate with each other. I am going to go back really quick because I think we have maybe only a couple minutes left, but I do want to look at our poll results again, because that is fascinating, especially for the second one, as they were coming in. I'm going to present that. So we can see that most people do prefer the sandwich method. So providing negative feedback in a little bit more of a diplomatic way, not so blunt and frank, which is not surprising. I think for a lot of us growing up, it's encouraged to give compliments along with any areas of improvement, which is right along with the indirect negative feedback line of thinking.
If you remember, if you have nothing nice to say, don't say it at all. I think that's a common American phrase. So it's very American to sandwich, you know, I feel in some ways, to give a random compliment on top of a negative.
And so next week, we will be doing scales 3 through 6. And this does wrap up our first week of scales. But, you know, if you want to discuss more about scales 1 through 2 at all next week as well, we can definitely roll that in. And we will be a little bit more active in terms of quizzes and polls. So just be ready to come and share your thoughts and engage. And we're really excited. But thank you so much, everyone, for this first week. And I know it's right at time, so I'll make sure not to take up too much of your precious work hours. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.